Well, it's that spooky time of year again. As is tradition for me at this point, I'm required to talk about at least one horror game, regardless if this comes out before or after Halloween. But as I mentioned in my last spooky time video, horror really isn't my favorite genre. I respect it, and I actually like a lot of the creativity and aesthetics that can come from it, but wandering around just to get scared just isn't for me. Survival horror is much more of my style. Survival horror where I have a solid chance of fighting back specifically. Now, admittedly, Doom 3 was more on the edge of survival horror, more of action horror, as you're never really hurting for resources in that game, and you have more than enough firepower to blast anything that jumps out at you in the face, and then 2 more times just for good measure. So this time I thought I would talk about a game that dips a bit more into the survival part of the horror, but still keeps up with the action. Now, I know among survival horror fans, The Evil Within isn't exactly held in the highest regards. In fact, a lot of people were pretty disappointed by it, as apparently it didn't live up to the survival horror experience they were hoping it would bring. Not to say that it was completely hated, but it certainly isn't as beloved as the games it was influenced by, like Resident Evil and Silent Hill, which I think is where the problem lies for many people. Since everyone was looking for the next big modern-day survival horror series at the time, I think they consciously or unconsciously compared it to some of the giants of the genre. Of course, it didn't help that The Evil Within was wearing its influences on its sleeves, but when it inevitably didn't meet people's expectations of what they wanted it to be, disappointment set in. However, there were also plenty of people who, regardless of expectations, still enjoyed The Evil Within. Or were like me and really didn't play survival horror games that much, so we really didn't have any standards to begin with. In fact, in many ways, this game set the standard for survival horror games for me, as next to Dead Space, it was one of the first real survival horror games I ever played. I do understand why some people were disappointed by this game's take on the survival horror genre. Unlike Resident Evil or Silent Hill, The Evil Within is much more action-oriented than one might expect. Now, decent action in a survival horror game isn't inherently a bad thing. Games like Dead Space, Alan Wake, and even the later Resident Evil games prove that. But I believe people wanted the slow, tension-filled crawl you get from the old days of survival horror when you're not sure if you'll have enough ammo to fight off the next nightmare that comes at you. But to be fair to The Evil Within, it does do that. In the beginning. It just doesn't stay that way, because The Evil Within is a survival horror that progresses into action horror. You start this game with darn near nothing. Ammo is incredibly limited, you can't hold much. What little ammo you do scrounge up will probably be wasted because you don't do a lot of damage. You'll most likely end up missing most of your shots anyway, since accuracy is terrible. Sebastian literally can't run to save his life, and you can die in like 3 to 4 hits. This game really wanted you to know that you do not stand a chance. In fact, direct combat is pretty much unadvised in the beginning. Instead, this game encourages you to find different ways to avoid or dispatch enemies, whether that's sneaking by them, stealth killing them, using environmental traps against them, or luring them in to get burnt by your matches. The matches are probably one of my favorite mechanics in this game. You start out thinking that they're just a way to make sure enemies are dead or stay dead, and as a quick side tangent, I think The Evil Within is one of the better games to pull off the is it dead or not gimmick in horror games. But eventually you'll realize that you can use the matches to burn any enemy that gets close to anything that you burn, once again encouraging you to find different ways to deal with enemies and save on resources. It's only until you start upgrading yourself that your chances of survival start to go up. While they might not be horribly noticeable at first, once you start upgrading stats like accuracy, weapon damage, and critical damage, which are things I would highly suggest you upgrade along with stamina, fighting becomes way more viable. But make no mistake, even as you upgrade yourself and get stronger, this game is quick to remind you that it is still a survival horror game. Because while the game does give you enough resources to protect yourself, generally speaking, it's never enough for you to rely on any specific weapon or method of attack. Creativity in combat is still very much encouraged, and that includes using every weapon, which you actually get a lot of, in your inventory. The Agony Crossbow is the standout weapon in this game because of that. Its different bolts give rise to different methods of dealing with enemies, such as stunning a group of enemies with a shock bolt to take them all out with an environmental trap or match, or freezing or blinding them with a flash or freeze bolt, leaving them open for stealth kills or to be hit with your other weapons. While many people did enjoy this open-ended approach to the combat, the slow progression from pathetic to strong was a big turnoff from the game for many others. And yeah, only being able to run for like 2 seconds at the beginning is definitely annoying, but given how strong you get by the end of the game and going into New Game Plus, I understand why they start you out as below average. I know my opinions on horror games make me a little biased, but I actually like this progression. It makes you feel the tension and near helplessness of fighting with very limited resources, and makes searching for and finding resources satisfying as anything helps in the beginning, but at the same time, the upgrades mean you don't have to remain helpless. You're not stuck trying to run, hide, and avoid combat. You have agency in how you want to approach things. You still have to be clever with your resource management, but facing down enemies can be just as valid as avoiding them. The only problem with all of that is the survival horror mechanics often conflict with the high intense action of the game. You'll often get thrown into combat scenarios where you have to defeat a number of enemies. While these moments can be pretty intense as you have to balance your resources more than usual as you work to defend yourself, the survival part of this game can make the controls a little clunky and frustrating in these moments. For example, aiming is just hard in this game, no matter how much you upgrade accuracy, and the last thing I need is to miss 3 shots in a row when I've only got 4 and there's an enemy barreling down on me. And Sebastian can move around kind of awkwardly. I think this is because he commits to many of his movements, so he'll take a step or two before he moves in whatever other direction you want him to go in. Great for realism, but it is very frustrating when I'm trying to avoid taking a life-ending hit and Sebastian can't seem to figure out what direction he wants to go in. Or when I'm trying to stun an enemy with a melee attack and he hits everything but the enemy. This game is disgusting. In a good way. Most horror games tend to use blood, gore, dirt, and rust as a way to elicit fear. They set the tone for the game, signifying to the player that you are not safe here. Now, I believe there are 2 main approaches horror games can take when using these environmental details. The first method is the active threat. Someone or something killed someone here and you might be next. I've explained how games like Dune 3, for example, perfectly use those environmental details to create a feeling of unease as you never really know when something might jump out and attack you. So all that blood and gore is a very active warning that there is definitely something out there waiting to tear you limb from limb, you just don't know where or when it will attack. The second method is more for aesthetic. Those environmental details are more meant to give you the idea that dirty, disgusting, and bloody things have gone down in whatever location you might be in, but it doesn't inherently mean that you are in direct danger. More often than not, at least in my experience, horror games tend to go for the latter method. And oftentimes they do little more than remind you, oh yeah, you're playing a horror game. They'll just slap some blood and intros on a wall and say, ooh, scary. Are you scared yet? They're the insides of a man on a wall, isn't that scary? It can be pretty lazy. That said, there are horror games that use the aesthetic method very well. Instead of just trying to create the aesthetic by having you step over some brain matter here and there, these games say, what if the whole aesthetic was the gore and grime? What if the whole game just looked like a factory that grinded up human flesh? The Evil Within is one of those games. The level design and art direction in Evil Within can best be described as putrid, dirty, and painful. While there are many chapters that take place in various seemingly unconnected locations, which would normally be considered a bad thing as it means there's little to no consistency in the level design or art direction, due to the nature of this game and where it takes place, for as all over the place as the levels may be, the one constant detail that keeps them all connected is that they all look dirty, bloody, and putrid in one way or another. Ransacked villages, decrepit hospitals, destroyed cities, rotten meat factories, dirty sewers, all filled with traps that look like they're going to give you tetanus or some other infection just from looking at them. And this theme of gore and pain extends to the enemies as well. The enemies just look gross and demented, like they spend a little too much time in the labyrinth with Pinhead. They often appear like they died painfully and came back to life wearing the instruments and scars that tortured and killed them, being wrapped in barbed wire, covered in broken glass, and impaled with spears and hooks. And when they don't look like that, they look like slimy, mutated fusions of one or more creatures. It all just looks like it came from the mind of someone who hated everything and wanted to cause people nothing but pain. And these next details are admittedly more of a stretch on my part, but the visuals with the film grain and the constant dust you see in the air add to this effect. I know along with the optional letterbox settings, those details are meant to give it an old cinematic horror feeling, but I actually like them. I know a lot of people found those settings annoying and visually bothersome, but it's hard to deny the visual effect the combination of the letterboxes, the grain, and the lighting give to the game. Plus, I like to think of them as like fourth wall details showing that the game itself is old and dirty. At some points, it can seem like it teeters on being too much and unnecessarily gory. Like, seriously, what is this even for? It just looks like it's meant to look like it will kill you painfully. And why is there even a pool of blood here? Like, really, like, there's no point in it, it's just there to look gory. But the thing is, it kind of has to lean into the gory aesthetic, because I can't say that this game is particularly scary. Outside of maybe 2 levels, the hospital and the manor, that I think actually do a pretty good job at creating a quiet, unsettling atmosphere, and maybe a few jump scares here and there, most of the game never really manages to be as scary as I think it wants to be. This is partially because it uses a lot of horror cliches and also reuses a lot of sounds and animations. I can only see and hear the same thing so many times before it loses its effect. If you've seen or played enough in the horror genre, nothing should catch you off guard in this game. Starting off, this game has a pretty solid hook. Beginning the game as a detective investigating a mass homicide at a mental hospital, only for things to take a very sharp left turn as the world literally starts breaking apart, mutant creatures and demented zombies rise out of nowhere, and the laws of physics begin breaking down as you're thrown from location to location with no explanation. It creates a sick but interesting world to play in, as now you have to trudge through disgusting environments, fight off unhinged monsters and sadistic traps, all while trying to find out what is causing this breakdown in reality. And what I particularly like about the mystery of this game is not only do we the player not have any idea what's going on, but the characters themselves are also completely clueless. In fact, I would go so far as to say that despite being the main character of the game, Sebastian is pretty much a side character in the whole story, being unwillingly thrust into the events of the game, simply trying to survive and help who he can. And even by the end of it all, he walks out of it still not truly understanding the full scope of everything that he went through. The problem is that we, the player, also walk out of it not fully understanding everything that happened and why. For anyone who's playing this game for the first time, it is very hard to tell what is going on, which I'm pretty sure is on purpose because, spoiler for anyone who hasn't played the game yet, this is all happening in someone's mind. It's not supposed to make sense. And to the game's credit, it uses that concept very well. Because you're in Ruvik's demented and psychopathic mind, he can not only influence the minds of all the other people who are connected to him, but also the very landscape of his mind itself, making all the monsters and reality warping possible because much of what you're seeing are the fragments of his memories and the broken psyche of him and those who are connected to him. Once you figure that out, things begin to make more sense. Or at least the lack of sense starts to become more understandable. You're essentially in another man's very lucid dream. But because we only view everything through the perspective of someone who's just getting violently dragged along for the ride, our view of the story is literally as small as his is. I'm not sure if that was done on purpose, but that limited view makes it a little hard to follow the story, because Sebastian has no connection to any of the plot. So neither him or us have any idea what's going on, and we never really figure it out either. Any significant story details told through the environment, enemies, or even the characters don't really mean much because they are realistically not important to Sebastian and are unknowingly important to the player. We never learn how or why any of it happened, how we became a part of it, or what happened to any of the characters. All we know for sure by the end of it is that Sebastian made it out. The game tries to compensate for what it doesn't naturally tell you through cutscenes and dialogue by giving the player notes which expand on the story and characters that can be found around each chapter of the game. But the game relies too heavily on these notes to explain what should have been conveyed through the story. For example, if you want to learn anything about Sebastian, the main character, you have to read the notes. The game does almost nothing to explore his character. Some of this could have been mitigated if Sebastian became more involved in the plot as it progressed. He didn't even need a direct connection to Ruvik, but giving Sebastian a motivation more than just, I have no idea what's going on, I'm just trying to survive, would have done wonders. This lack of proper storytelling also stems from the game trying to tell 3 different stories, Mobius, Sebastian, and Ruvik's, all at the same time, while really only having enough time for one of them. Mobius is the overarching big bad of 1 and 2. They're the usual shady corporation pulling strings from the shadows, including the STEM program that everyone is connected to. Sebastian, being the least connected out of the 3, at least in this game, has a tragic past involving losing his daughter to a fire and his wife going missing while investigating her death, with both events supposedly being orchestrated by Mobius. Both of these plots are important to the overarching story of Evil Within, but they're not explored or fleshed out much in this game. While both do get explored further in the DLCs and the sequel, in the base game of 1, they feel more like left open plot threads rather than concepts that will be touched on at later points. The only one who walks away with a fairly decent fleshed out story is Ruvik, which is to be expected given that he's the main villain, and he's a darn good one at that. Ruvik's presence is felt throughout the whole game. With him having complete control over Stim, he appears as this godlike entity distorting the world around you however he sees fit, even appearing in front of you to watch, chase, or hinder your progress as if just to mess with you, because he could realistically end you at any point. And for as edgy as it kind of is, as the game reveals his traumatic past and slow descent into madness, it does give reason to the cruel horrors and sadistic, over-the-top traps we see throughout the game. Unfortunately, that character development can't really be said about the other characters and the dialogue as a whole. You may hear the most common complaint about the characters is that they're very bare bones and stereotypical. You know, Sebastian is the hard-boiled detective, Joseph is the straight-laced intellectual, Kidman is the rookie nobody likes, and so on. Which, yeah, those are absolutely problems, but my bigger complaint is that everybody is so stiff and non-emotive. I'm not sure if it's the voice acting, writing, or both, but the way they talk does not match the horror and intensity of what is happening around them. It's not like they don't acknowledge it, but Sebastian will literally get thrown from one place to another with zero logic as to how he got there, and he'll just say,
"What is going on here?"
Other times, they'll suddenly start talking to each other about something from one of their pasts, something that had not been discussed up until that point, and then never follow up on it. So we're left wondering what any of what they said was all about.
You ever had the urge to just jump? When you're on a high place? Or the subway rolls by? Imagine if you had that urge for a minute straight.
Who the f starts a conversation like that? I just sat down.
Again, they rely on the notes you find to fill in the gaps of the story, and then will start talking about something assuming you read the contextual notes. Personally, unless you're going the From Software route of storytelling, story and character notes found throughout a game should only add more context and background to them. They should not tell whole chunks of the story. Because 1, it breaks the show don't tell rule of storytelling, and 2, if I happen to miss a certain note in the game and there's no way to go back for it, I may have missed vital story or character info simply because I unknowingly walked past it. Admittedly, the game does put the more important ones in your face, and there could be an argument made about what one would consider vital information in a story, which is a conversation to be had another time. The point is, there are several plot holes in this game that are never explained, or they waited until the second game to expand them. Now again, I understand I have no standards when it comes to survival horror games, but every time I play this game, I'm left wondering why people disliked The Evil Within. I know I spent the whole beginning of this video explaining the reasons why, but frankly, they just don't make sense to me. I've seen plenty of videos of other people talking about it, and while they often bring up valid criticisms, like some of the clunky controls, the story, and the visual options, many of them often devolve into nitpicks. Like there's too much action, there's no inventory system, the upgrades ruin the survival horror elements, it rips off Resident Evil, it rips off Silent Hill, it's not enough like those games. And then these nitpicks are often rather hypocritical, as some of the things they complain about in The Evil Within are some of the same things found in other notable survival horror games. In fact, The Evil Within actually has several innovative ideas for the survival horror genre, such as the stealth and the open-ended approach to combat. So it begs the question, whether those complaints are considered flaws or plotted in those other games, what makes their existence in those games more tolerable than their existence in The Evil Within? That's definitely a deeper question for a deeper video in The Evil Within. In the end, I think it comes down to what people consider true survival horror, which is something that I've learned through the course of making this video. I don't think anyone really knows. Some people attribute it to the olden days of the genre with the tight camera angles and controls, spongy enemies, and a horrible lack of resources, while other people look at more modern examples of the genre to set their standards, where action has become more of a focus. It's clear though that The Evil Within had its own idea on what survival horror was, An idea that I think, whether people want to admit it or not, is much more like what everyone has come to know, but just approached from a different angle, as I think this game combines ideas from both examples. Lesson of the day, kids: just because something doesn't reach the same bar as its predecessors, it doesn't inherently mean it's bad. I know I've said in the past that it's important to compare a game to its predecessors to see how it's improved or changed. I was talking about sequels in that context, but that can apply to spiritual successors and successors of a genre. I also said that we shouldn't base the entire merit of a game on what it did or didn't do from its previous entries. That doesn't mean you have to like it. If you just didn't enjoy a game, that's fine. Maybe it just wasn't for you. Or maybe it really was just a bad game. But if you're only looking at a game for what it didn't do, then you'll miss all the things that it does do. We should be able to objectively look at a game and enjoy it for what it pulls off well and properly critique it on what it can do better. I think this game is great. Sure, it has its problems, but what game doesn't? To all the survival horror fans out there that didn't like this game, I am curious to know, what about this game was so disappointing to you, outside of its obvious flaws? What about this game in comparison to the other games in the genre made it come up short for you? Or, on the flip side, what about this game was so enjoyable to you, and where does it sit in comparison to other games of the genre you've played? Regardless of your opinions though, I always appreciate you guys taking the time out of your day to watch these videos, and I hope to see you in the next one, which I am planning to be a big one, and I'm hoping to get it out fairly soon, so look forward to that. But either way, thanks for watching.